So welcome participants to another session of MOOC course on disaster management. I am Shahab Fazal, faculty in the Department of Geography at Aligarh Muslim University. In our previous discussions, we explored the term disaster, hazards and risk, their significance and relevance in disaster studies, the distinction between hazard and disaster. Further, we looked into the hazard identification, classification and preventive measures, which are so critical in the context of disaster studies. We also tried to highlight their different dimensions and features. Further, for understanding the above concepts, a technical evaluation process is required, commonly called as hazard assessment, vulnerability analysis, or risk analysis. These are structured analytical procedures for identifying hazard and estimate their occurrence and consequences under certain conditions. So these procedures are very important to understand, especially in the context of theoretical understanding of these basic procedures in the context of disaster studies. Hazards and vulnerabilities are aggregated into risk, and risk can be seen subjectively or objectively. They can be analyzed or perceived also. So a subjective risk is the risk perceived by the people affected, which determines their willingness to accept a potential hazard and take steps, measures to tackle it. So in this session, we would highlight and peep into the term of vulnerability in much detail. So for that, understanding the term vulnerability is very important. We all know that vulnerability is derived from the word vulnerare. It's a Latin term. It means to wound, to wound. It could be seen as an indicator of areas of greater concern in modern day with respect to a system. It relates with suffering, it relates with pain, but in modern day system, it can be treated as the areas, the infrastructure, the people who have suffered and are of great concern. So vulnerability gives the extent to which a community is affected by a disaster. It involves the measures of resilience and coping capacity of a community in the face of adversity. I am interchangingly using the term vulnerability, resilience and risk. I have tried to explain it in my previous discussions on these terms. So here, resilience and coping capacity developed over time as a result of proactive policies, and vulnerability is an inclusive concept in which the vulnerability of a particular community to a particular type of disaster is a resultant effect of a number of factors or situations. So now in this includes physical factors. I may bring in the geographical perspective, the social factors, the sociological perspective, or economic factors with economic perspective, like income, environment, employment. Besides, institutional or administrative are also very important component and perspective, which are essentially governance related issues. But the process of vulnerability has been evidenced as proceeding along phases like root cause or dynamic pressure that translate into active problems. So in that context, you would understand that vulnerability is having very multi-dimensional impact on disasters, and which may be the result, the vulnerability may be the result of priority decision making. For example, drought in a dryland area leading to a famine in the absence of disaster mitigation efforts. That is a good example of how we perceive vulnerability. Now, social scientists and natural scientists, climate related study experts often interpret vulnerability differently. The social scientists tend to view vulnerability as representing the set of socioeconomic factors that determine human ability to cope with the stress or change, while climate scientists and physical scientists often view vulnerability in terms of the likelihood of the occurrence and impact of physical occurrences like weather and climate related events or any physical event, whether it is natural or man-made. Mostly it is the natural. So here some related terminology are fragility, stability, resilience and sensitivity, and they belong to the system in which these situations exist. So these are the constituents of vulnerability. I'll repeat: fragility, stability, resilience and sensitivity in the context of vulnerability. So in this regard, there are some definitions like vulnerability is the likelihood that an individual or group will be exposed to and adversely affected by a hazard. Here the interaction is among the hazard of place, which is related to risk and mitigation, dependent on the social profile of the communities. So it has both these dimensions among which the interaction take place to evolve the vulnerability at any specific location due to any specific hazard. So combining the two ideas, we can define vulnerability as the characteristics of a person or groups of persons, large number of people, who are first susceptible to the impacts of a hazard, and second, have reduced capacity to recover from that hazardous event. So on one side, it is the hazard, the natural event or even man-made event also, but the event is important, and on the other hand, the vulnerability is linked to the human ability, their capacity to overcome that adverse situation. This introduces the idea of susceptibility and resilience. So vulnerability can be considered broadly as a function of susceptibility and resilience. Susceptibility is the fact of being exposed, and resilience is the capacity to adjust, overcome, recover when the external shocks strike. The following cases, they elaborate the concept. For example, a house of a person is located in flood-prone zone, which is not built to withstand the floods. But the person has enough resources to rebuild the house once it gets damaged. He also has another house where he can relocate himself during the flood condition. So in this case, the person is susceptible but resilient. Now you would understand that what this resilience and susceptibility means. If I can take another example, in another case, if the person has no house to relocate in the same situation or resources to rebuild house after the flood condition, but the house itself is built to withstand the floods and not be affected much. So in this case, the person is not resilient but also not susceptible to the hazard. Another situation. Let us consider the person who does not have a flood-proof house, nor does he have alternate resources to rebuild or additional house where he can relocate himself during the floods. This is the third situation. In this case, the person becomes vulnerable to the impact of flood. These examples will give you an idea as to what we mean with vulnerability and how different kind of vulnerability which relates to the hazard as well as the human ability, resilience to cope and overcome any situation, any hazardous situation. So susceptibility has physical connotations and is easier to assess. It can be considered as the proximity and exposure to the hazard. Resilience, on the other hand, is a complex concept consisting of multiple parameters. It may be like access to resources, their capacities, etc. And they are harder to assess than susceptibility. So resilience is a little complicated. Now here I will also bring into the conflict and governance issues, how their impact they have bearing on vulnerability issues. For example, fragile states often lack the governance structures which are so essential to manage disaster risks, making them more susceptible to severe impacts. The economic vulnerability that I will relate with limited resources and infrastructure in fragile regions hinder the effective disaster response and recovery. That would be the economic vulnerability. The chain of linkages characterizing the system provides the base for the notion of fragility. This complex internal structure at risk receives importance for analysis in the emergency field of risk assessment. Stability is another propensity of a system to attain and retain the equilibrium condition of a steady state. Whereas resilience is the ability of a system to maintain its structure and patterns of behavior in the face of disturbance. So fragility significantly impacts disaster preparedness and response and also pose challenges to the vulnerable communities. Creates challenge for vulnerable communities, for example, by limited resources. In fragile settings, many a times lack of financial, human, technical resources to rebuild the disaster impact areas, disaster preparedness plans, or execute effective responses to the crisis situation. This way it may challenge the vulnerable communities. It may also challenge through weak governance, for example, political instability. In crisis situation, weak governance can play adversely to the resilience as well as it enhances the vulnerability. So weak governance may be because of that political instability or poor governance. It undermines the coordination efforts, leading to delays or insufficiency in disaster response. There may be infrastructural challenges also. These fragile regions, crisis affected regions often have inadequate infrastructure, which makes it difficult to, for example, to evacuate the affected people or to provide medical aid during any crisis situation. So these infrastructure are also very important and critical, which adds to the vulnerability. Some more important kind of vulnerability can be most important, which comes to my mind, is that of poverty, lack of education, inequality in the society. These factors make it harder for communities to prepare for disasters and, more importantly, to recover after the crisis situation or the disaster. The manifestation of hazard creates additional stresses for vulnerable group. It interacts with pre-existing vulnerabilities and creates multi-dimensional adversities. The lack of fallback mechanism or coping capacities due to the weaknesses of the system, which I have tried to highlight, they translate the hazards into greater disasters. Here, the pre-existing vulnerabilities are often responsible for creating the disasters and its intensity, while disasters only add to the stress and creating further vulnerabilities in the among the affected population. It often results in the creation of cyclic nature of vulnerability. Thus, vulnerability act as cause as well as consequences of disasters. You would understand that there are certain pre-existing vulnerability, and some vulnerability is the result of the disaster, and they have cyclic nature. So in that context, I am saying that the vulnerability act as a cause and also consequences of the disasters. And in that context, sensitivity is used to measure the magnitude of negative impacts of any kind of changes, the physical changes. The change can have both positive and negative impacts on human societies. Yes, both positive and negative impacts. And sensitivity and resilience is used to describe the quality of the system. And the sensitivity refers to the degree to which a given system undergoes changes, transformations due to the forces following the human interference. While resilience could be understood as the ability to reproduce its capability after interference and the measure of the need for human modification to it. So in such manner, we may define sensitivity or susceptibility as the degree of the entire system, component change associated with a given degree of human induced stress and resilience, which are the ability of a particular ecosystem to maintain the basic structure essential to support humans. So, just to sum up, I would say the vulnerability as a concept has a strong theoretical foundation, but the quantification of vulnerability is complex. And this complexity is due to its subjectivity, relativity, and also dynamicity. With time and space, it changes. So in that context, dynamicity also. We can observe that certain aspects of vulnerability are generic, like poverty, but others are dynamic. So vulnerability measurement in disaster management involves assessing the susceptibility of the communities, society, systems, or assets to the impacts of hazards. This process is crucial for effective disaster risk reduction and to the larger disaster management. Basically, it refers to first identifying the hazards. So, understanding the type of hazard, whether it is natural or man-made, and the community or a system who are exposed to that hazard, to identify them, it's very important and critical. Secondly, assessing the vulnerabilities. First, we have identified the hazards. Now, assessing the vulnerabilities. Evaluating factors such as demographic features, characteristic, social environment, political conditions, that make people, society, population either more susceptible to disaster or more equipped to cope with the adverse situation. Here the tools and framework will also be very important and critical. Tools like the WHO's strategic tool for assessing risk, commonly known as STAR help. They help in systematically measuring the vulnerabilities and guiding disaster preparedness and responses. The vulnerabilities may have also many dimensions and types, like physical vulnerability. This is the vulnerability of a person or a physical component, etc. It can be natural, environmental, like landslide prone zone, or anthropogenic. For example, if the building structure is unsafe, it is depleted, so that will come into the anthropogenic vulnerability. There can be social vulnerability. This type of vulnerability arises due to the social status and structure of the person in which he or she is living. The example could be the caste, social groups, even education status, health facilities available, access to health facilities, age, young or old, something like that. These may be the examples of social vulnerability. There can be economic vulnerability that depends on economic status. Poverty, poor communities are more vulnerable to hazard as they have fewer resources with limited capacity to access these resources. So the impacts of disasters would be greater to them, and that is why their economic vulnerability results into more suffering from the hazardous situation or the disaster. There can also be environmental vulnerability. Now, this type of vulnerability is most dependent on the natural resource depletion or resource degradation, which in modern day has enormous impact over the human being. And in all kinds of crisis situation, this adds another dimension to it. The way the human being, they are not only using, consuming the resources, but also the human activities are leading to degradation of resources, pollution of resources, depletion of resources. That also leads to the vulnerable situation. So vulnerability is the conditions determined by physical, social, economic and environmental factors, or the processes which increase the susceptibility of a community to the hazardous condition. And vulnerability identification implies examining the root cause of vulnerability that could lie in technological, physical, socio-economic conditions, and addressing the same through empirical research and also policy interventions. Vulnerability is challenging because of the complex processes which are also inherent to the system, which makes even more complex. Vulnerability becomes even more complex because of certain vulnerable situations, certain situations already existing in the system. Vulnerability has come across as a challenge of development and also the solution, which lies in the policy analysis of developmental planning with a view to make sustainable development measures more precise and need-based with respect to reducing the vulnerability. I would say vulnerability are also circumstances in which any community, system or assets that make it susceptible to the damaging effects of a hazard. It represents the intersection between exposure to physical threats and the capacity of people and system to absorb, respond to and to recover from these threats. In the Indian context, vulnerability identification takes on special significance due to the country's diverse geographical features and socio-economic conditions. From the flood-prone Brahmaputra Valley to drought-susceptible regions in Rajasthan, from densely populated urban centers of North India to remote tribal communities, vulnerability profiles vary dramatically across the subcontinent. So, in this slide gives you a fair idea about different types of vulnerability and how it impacts the people and the society. It actually highlights the nature and status of vulnerability and its implication also. So, physical exposure factors relates to the geographical positioning of the communities. Not only the communities but also infrastructure in relation to the potential hazards. The examples can be proximity to hazard zones. Now, very obviously you can understand that the people, the communities, settlements located near fault lines, they are prone to, say, earthquake. The communities located near coastlines, prone to cyclones. The communities close to river banks, susceptible to flooding conditions. And they face inherently higher exposure. Another could be the infrastructural quality, the resilience of the buildings, road, bridges, infrastructure, utilities, determines how well a community can withstand the disastrous events. So, substandard construction and material significantly increases the vulnerability. In modern day settlement patterns, for example, unplanned urban growth, hazardous location like steep slopes or floodplains, or near any hazardous industrial unit, they increases the exposure. So, settlement pattern can also be one very important feature for vulnerability. The environmental degradation. In modern day, in the context of climate change, I would say that loss of natural buffers such as mangroves along the coastlines, or deforestation like Amazon forest depletion, or hillside forest cover like in Assam and in Kashmir and Himachal Pradesh. These degradation, environmental degradation, can increase hazard exposure. The good example is that of 2013 Uttarakhand flood. It demonstrates how environmental degradation amplified the disaster impacts. Another is human vulnerability, where the social, economic, institutional aspects determine how individuals and communities prepare, respond and recover from disasters. This includes, for example, awareness and risk perception, access to resources, which means financial resources, food security, access to healthcare, etc. also. I may also add the social networks, which is so important for measuring the human vulnerability. The modern day materialistic society, it results into greater vulnerability. And on the contrary, strong community bonds, social support system can provide crucial assistance during emergencies, crisis situation. In India, traditional joint family system in India, it often provides safety nets during the crisis situation. Very easily you can relate it during how the traditional joint system in rural settlements have helped to overcome the corona crisis when the people had to migrate back to their native places from the urban settlements without any resource with them, but they get accommodated in the traditional joint family rural settlement lifestyle. Another could be the institutional capacity, the effectiveness of local governance, disaster management authorities and emergency services, etc. They also supports, influences the vulnerability. If they perform well, they help to reduce the vulnerability. But if they perform not up to the mark, not satisfactorily, then it enhances the vulnerability. The interaction between physical exposure and human vulnerability creates complex risk landscapes. For instance, you see two communities face identical flood exposure, but their outcomes during a disaster can differ dramatically based on factors like economic resources, social cohesion, and institutional support. This gives another type socioeconomic dynamics influencing the vulnerability. Several socioeconomic factors significantly influences the vulnerability patterns across India. Understanding these dynamics is crucial for developing effective vulnerability strategies. Here I would bring the gender dimension. Now, gender often plays a decisive role in determining vulnerability levels. The care responsibilities the women often bear, primary responsibility for children, elderly, and the family members, that enhances the socioeconomic vulnerability. The economic dependence for certain section of the society, the mobility restrictions, the resource excess, where unequal access to information, skill, training, that leave less prepared for the disasters, enhancing the vulnerability. The poverty and economic marginalization also remains perhaps the most significant vulnerability factor in terms of limited resources for preparedness. Poverty. Livelihood vulnerabilities also are important. So, the societies who are dependent on nature-based low-income livelihood like agriculture, fishing, increases the disaster vulnerability. Small farmers in drought-prone regions face particular challenges. So, these livelihood vulnerability is also important in this context. If I can add, similarly, education levels also impact vulnerability, especially in the context of risk understanding. Access to information, adaptive capacity, economic opportunities, they all are related to education levels. It impacts the vulnerability. Another related type can be the social inequality and marginalization. So, effective vulnerability identification must recognize these intersectional factors, which are very complex. For example, an elderly woman from a marginalized community living in a flood-prone area faces compounded vulnerabilities, and that require integrated support approaches. Since her vulnerability are of different types, it has to be addressed collectively to reduce the vulnerability. So, in that context, it is very important to understand, identify the vulnerability. So, to conclude, I would say that vulnerability assessment is a subset of risk assessment which analyzes differential vulnerability of communities in different areas of disaster impact, where precise quantification of risk may be difficult, but we can only do a gross estimation of risk. For example, number of death and the number of people exposed to a hazard is a crude estimate. It gives only a limited idea of the likely damage from the hazard for different people at different places. This is only the probability of occurrence of hazardous event. So, vulnerability is a product of prevailing socio-cultural and economic transformation, all the processes involving it in the society. It might also be a product of prevailing underdevelopment in the society, or a product of immediate and long-term disaster responses also. So, the vulnerability with practical perspective of policy design emphasizes on development as an integrated perspective, integrating socioeconomic development, ecological perspective to construct a comprehensive framework on disaster. The emphasis on poverty alleviation and community empowerment sustainability of livelihoods, equitable participation through empowerment, different responsibilities, they all play a very important role. The success of vulnerability reduction ultimately depends on translating identification into meaningful interventions that addresses the root causes rather than merely responding to the symptoms. What do you think? How local community can respond to any vulnerability profile which can change the vulnerability of any community in response to any hazard, like in modern day increasing climate related variability? How the local community can support the vulnerability, can address the vulnerability? Think about it. And what specific steps can be taken to reduce the vulnerability, especially for the marginalized group in your region? Think and comment. Actually, I just want to pose this question to give you an understanding to, to the concept of vulnerability. As I gave you the task of identifying the vulnerability for marginalized society in any area which is impacted by climate change impacts, hazards. You all know that this climate change hazard would be more destructive to the economically poor people, the people who are poor, involved with primary occupation. Think about it. I conclude this session now. Thanks for joining. Happy learning.